Dawn broke bloody over the Texas plains, painting the horizon in shades of rust and amber. The freight wagon creaked along the rocky trail, its wheels grinding against stone and sand with each labored turn. Inside, 8-year-old Clara Pennington clutched her rag doll tighter, her knuckles white as bone, as the wagon jolted over another rut. The morning fog hung thick as cotton, muffling the sounds of the wilderness. Clara's parents had died of fever 3 months ago, leaving her to travel with the Henderson family toward Fort Worth, where her uncle, the Texas governor, would take her in. She pressed her face against the wagon's canvas, watching the endless expanse of scrub brush and red dirt roll past. Then the gunshots cracked through the morning stillness. The first bullet shattered the wagon's wooden frame, sending splinters flying. Clara screamed as Mrs. Henderson fell backward, blood spreading across her calico dress. Mr. Henderson shouted something Clara couldn't understand over the thundering of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifles. Masked riders emerged from the fog like demons from hell, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas, their eyes cold and calculating. They surrounded the wagon with practiced efficiency, cutting off any escape route. Clara watched in horror as they gunned down Mr. Henderson, his body crumpling beside the wagon's front wheel. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "Please don't hurt me." The bandit leader, a grizzled man with silver hair and a scar across his left cheek, dismounted and approached the wagon. He looked down at Clara with something that might have been pity, but his voice remained hard as flint. "Sorry, little one. Orders are orders." He grabbed Clara by the arm, ignoring her terrified sobs, and threw her across his saddle. As they rode away, Clara caught a glimpse of the wagon burning behind them, black smoke rising into the morning sky like a funeral pyre. The sound of a wounded horse's screams followed them across the plains, growing fainter with each mile. Through her tears and terror, Clara heard fragments of the bandits' conversation as they rode hard toward the distant hills. "The boss HV wants this done clean," one man called out to another. "No mistakes this time." "Don't worry," the leader replied. "Once we dump her body in Comanche territory, it'll look like Indian work. Boss gets his war, and we get our money." Clara didn't understand what they meant, but she pressed the words into her memory, along with everything else about this nightmare. The raiders rode hard toward Comanche territory, their leader fingering a blood-stained handkerchief in his pocket. Payment from a man who wanted this little girl dead in a way that would blame the Comanche and justify taking their land. 3 days later, Chief Tenbear led his small band of warriors across the same rocky terrain, their horses moving with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in the saddle. At 42, Tenbear carried the scars of countless battles, a deep groove across his left temple from a cavalry saber burn marks on his arms, from a fire set by settlers, and a pronounced limp from an old bullet wound that had shattered his right leg during a raid gone wrong. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as they rode, searching for signs of the white settlers' movements. Tenbear had learned to read the land like other men read books, understanding every broken branch and disturbed stone. His people called him wise, but he knew better. He was simply a man who had survived long enough to learn from his mistakes. Chief called out Swift Horse, his youngest warrior, pointing toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a dried creek bed. "Someone's been here." Tenbear rode closer, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Wagon tracks led to the trees, but they ended abruptly. Boot prints scattered in all directions, and the acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. This wasn't the work of his people. It was too sloppy, too wasteful. As they approached the trees, Tenbear heard a soft whimpering like a wounded animal. He dismounted carefully, his hand resting on his knife handle, and pushed through the undergrowth. There, tied to a cottonwood tree with rough rope, was a small white girl. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and dust. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and she was barely conscious, her head lolling forward in exhaustion. "Water," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. Tenbear looked around, his warrior's instincts alert. Two drunk outlaws sat nearby, arguing in harsh whispers about what to do with their captive. One wanted to sell her to slavers heading south. The other insisted they should kill her to cover their tracks. "She's worth more alive." The first man slurred, taking another pull from his whiskey bottle. "Governor's niece, they say. Could fetch a pretty price. I could get us all hanged too." The second replied, his hand moving to his gun. "Dead girls don't talk." Tenbear had heard enough. He signaled to his warriors, and they moved like shadows through the trees. The two outlaws never saw them coming. Within moments, both men lay unconscious, their weapons confiscated, their horses scattered. The girl looked up at Tenbear with eyes the color of prairie grass, wide with fear, but also something else, a desperate hope. He knelt beside her, carefully cutting the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. Her skin was raw and bleeding where the rope had chafed. "I won't hurt you," he said in careful English, his voice gentle despite its deep timbre. "You're safe now." She clutched a damaged rag doll against her chest, its button eyes hanging by threads, its yellow hair matted with dirt. Tenbear recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same expression he had seen in his own daughter's face years ago before the fever took her. He knew the danger of what he was about to do. Harboring a white child, especially one connected to settlers, could bring the full wrath of the U.S. Army down upon his people. But looking at this broken little girl, he couldn't abandon her to die alone in the wilderness. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Pennington." The name meant nothing to him then. But Tenbear carefully wrapped her in his own blanket, a traditional Comanche weaving his grandmother had made, and lifted her onto his horse. She was lighter than a feather, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. As they rode toward the Comanche camp, Clara said nothing, but her grip on the rag doll never loosened. Tenbear found himself wondering what kind of men would abandon a child to die in the wilderness, and what kind of world produced such cruelty. In her small fist, Clara clutched something else, a piece of white cloth she had grabbed during the chaos of the wagon attack. It was stained with blood and bore delicate embroidery that caught the light strangely. Tenbear noticed it, but thought nothing of it at the time. The fine stitching seemed oddly familiar, like something from a half-remembered dream, but he couldn't place it. He had no idea that the blood-stained handkerchief would soon reveal a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Texas government, or that it would put both their lives in mortal danger. For 5 days, Clara lived in Tenbear's camp, sleeping in his lodge and eating from his own bowl. He tended to her cuts and bruises with traditional medicines, teaching her words in Comanche while she slowly regained her strength. The other tribal members watched with mixture of concern and respect. They trusted their chief's judgment. But they also understood the risks he was taking. During these quiet days, Tenbear occasionally caught glimpses of the cloth Clara kept hidden in her dress pocket. Once when she was sleeping, he saw her small hand close around it, her fingers tracing the embroidered patterns. There was something familiar about the stitching, something that nagged at the edge of his memory like a name on the tip of his tongue. But he couldn't place it. The silver thread work was expensive, the kind only wealthy men could afford, and the patterns seemed to spell out initials, though he couldn't make them out clearly. Clara began to trust him because of his patient kindness. When nightmares woke her screaming, he would sit beside her, humming old Comanche lullabies until she fell back asleep. When she was too frightened to eat, he would tell her stories of brave warriors and wise animals until she smiled and took a few bites. He taught her practical skills too, how to move silently through grass, how to read the wind direction, how to stay perfectly still when danger approached. Clara was a quick learner, her young mind absorbing lessons that might save her life. "Why are you helping me?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Tenbear considered the question carefully. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because leaving you to die would have made me less than human." Clara nodded, as if this made perfect sense. She had begun to think of him not as a captor, but as a protector, perhaps the only person in the world who truly cared about her safety. That illusion shattered on the 6th morning. The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the plains, and Tenbear emerged from his lodge to see a column of U.S. Army cavalry approaching the camp. The blue uniforms and glinting sabers were unmistakable, as was the hostile intent in their formation. Captain Marcus Webb, a hard-faced man with steel-gray eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, rode at the head of the column. He had received his orders directly from Governor Pennington, along with a substantial bounty for Clara's rescue and specific instructions to use any means necessary to retrieve the governor's niece. Chief Tenbear. Webb called out, his voice carrying across the camp. By order of the territory of Texas, you are commanded to surrender the white girl you have kidnapped. The Comanche warriors moved to defensive positions, their weapons ready, but not yet drawn. Tenbear walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, Clara following close behind him. I kidnapped no one. Tenbear replied calmly. I found this child abandoned and dying. I saved her life. Webb's expression didn't change. The girl is Clara Pennington, niece of Governor Pennington. She was taken from a wagon train 6 days ago. Witnesses saw Comanche warriors in the area. Your witnesses lied. Tenbear said, his voice hardening. Or they were paid to lie. The captain's hand moved to his saber hilt. Surrender the girl immediately, or I will consider this an act of war. Clara stepped forward, her small chin raised defiantly. Her voice trembled, but carried clearly across the camp. I won't go with you. He didn't take me. He saved me. He's my family now. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. He had expected to find a traumatized child begging for rescue, not a girl defending her supposed captor. But his orders were clear, and the bounty was substantial. The girl is obviously confused. Webb said, his voice growing dangerous. She's been brainwashed by her captors. Men prepare to take her by force. The soldiers raised their rifles, and the air crackled with tension. Tenbear moved protectively in front of Clara, his eyes never leaving Webb's face. You will have to kill me first, he said quietly. Webb smiled coldly. That can be arranged? The confrontation that followed would change both their lives forever, setting in motion a chase across the Badlands that would uncover a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of Texas government, and force both a Comanche chief and a frightened little girl to discover just how far they would go to protect each other. Captain Webb's patience snapped like a dry twig. Fire warning shots, he commanded, his voice sharp as a blade. Show these savages we mean business. The soldiers raised their rifles skyward and fired in unison. The crack of gunfire echoed across the camp like thunder, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Horses reared and whinnied in panic, children screamed, and the Comanche warriors reached for their weapons. Tenbear threw himself over Clara, shielding her with his body, as chaos erupted around them. A piece of debris from a shattered water pot struck him in the ribs, and he felt the sharp pain of broken pottery cutting through his shirt. But he kept Clara covered, his arms forming a protective cage around her small form. Stay down, he whispered urgently. Don't move. The Comanche warriors responded with disciplined precision, even in the face of superior firepower. Swift Horse and 2 others began setting small fires around the camp's perimeter, using dry grass and brush to create thick columns of black smoke. The wind caught the smoke and spread it across the clearing, creating a gray haze that limited visibility. Clara, despite her fear, watched everything with the sharp eyes of a child learning to survive. She saw how the warriors moved, how they used the smoke as cover, how they communicated with subtle hand signals. These lessons would serve her well in the trials ahead. Now, Tenbear hissed, pulling Clara to her feet. We run. They sprinted toward the horses, staying low and using the smoke as cover. Clara's legs were shorter, but fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. Tenbear boosted her onto his warhorse, a powerful black stallion named Thunder Walker, and swung up behind her. The smoke screen worked perfectly, but only for a few precious minutes. As Tenbear and Clara galloped away from the camp, they could hear Webb shouting orders to his men. After them, don't let them escape. The chase began in earnest. 20 cavalry soldiers thundered across the plains in pursuit, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. Webb rode at the front, his face grim with determination. He had promised the governor he would retrieve Clara, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter how many Comanche he had to kill in the process. Tenbear knew every rock and ravine in this country, but his horse was carrying double weight, and the cavalry mounts were fresh. Bullets whistled past them, some close enough that he could feel the heat of their passage. "Hold tight," he told Clara, leaning forward over the horse's neck. "Don't let go." Clara pressed her face against his back, her small hands gripping his shirt with desperate strength. She could hear the soldiers gaining ground, their shouts growing louder with each passing moment. Thunderwalker was a magnificent animal, but even he couldn't maintain a full gallop indefinitely while carrying 2 riders. Tenbear could feel the horse beginning to tire his breathing, becoming labored. They needed to find cover, and fast. A narrow ravine appeared ahead, its red sandstone walls rising like ancient sentinels. Tenbear guided Thunderwalker into the ravine, hoping to use the confined space to their advantage. The cavalry would have to string out in single file, reducing their numerical superiority. But as they entered the ravine, disaster struck. Thunderwalker's front hoof caught in a loose stone, and the horse stumbled badly. Tenbear fought to keep them upright, but the momentum was too great. The horse went down hard, and Tenbear felt himself flying through the air. He landed heavily on his shoulder pane, shooting through his arm like fire. Clara tumbled beside him, her rag doll flying from her grasp. But even as he struggled to get up, Tenbear heard the ominous rumble of falling rocks echoing through the ravine. The landslide was small but effective. Loose stones cascaded down the ravine walls, triggered by the vibrations of the chase and the horse's fall. The rocks blocked the path behind them, creating a natural barrier that bought them precious time. He grabbed Clara and pulled her into a narrow crevice in the ravine wall, just as the first cavalry soldier appeared on the rocks above. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, barely breathing, as Webb's men searched the area. "They're down here somewhere." Webb's voice echoed from above. "Spread out and find them." For 3 hours, Tenbear and Clara huddled in the crevice, listening to the soldiers search overhead. Clara's face was pale with fatigue, and a thin trickle of blood ran from a cut on her forehead. But she made no sound, understanding instinctively that their lives depended on absolute silence. During the long wait, Tenbear pulled out his medicine pouch and carefully treated Clara's injuries. He cleaned the cut on her forehead with water from his canteen, then applied a paste made from crushed willow bark. "This will help it heal," he explained in whispers, "and it will keep infection away." Clara watched him work with fascination. "How do you know so much about medicine?" "My grandmother taught me," Tenbear replied. "She said knowledge of healing makes a warrior complete." When the cavalry finally moved on, Tenbear carefully emerged from their hiding place. Thunderwalker was gone, either dead or fled, and they were alone in the ravine with limited water and no food. "Are you hurt?" he asked Clara, examining the cut on her head more thoroughly. She shook her head, though he could see she was fighting back tears. "My doll," she whispered. "I lost my doll." Tenbear found the damaged toy near where they had fallen. One of its button eyes was missing, and its yellow hair was now matted with dirt and blood. But he picked it up carefully and handed it to Clara. "She's still here," he said gently. "A little broken, but still here." Clara hugged the doll close, and Tenbear saw something in her eyes, harden a determination he recognized from his own reflection. This little girl was stronger than she appeared, and she was learning to survive in a world that wanted to destroy her. As they prepared to leave the ravine on foot, Tenbear began teaching Clara more advanced survival skills. How to walk quietly on rocky ground without dislodging stones. How to find water by reading the color of distant vegetation. How to remain motionless when danger approached. "Remember," he said as they climbed the narrow deer trail leading out of the ravine, "the land is your ally if you know how to read it. But it will kill you if you don't respect it." Clara nodded seriously, her small face set with concentration. She was learning that survival wasn't just about being brave. It was about being smart, careful, and always thinking ahead. These lessons would serve her well in the trials ahead as their flight across the Badlands intensified. And the true nature of the conspiracy against them began to reveal itself. The chase resumed at dawn, more relentless than before. Captain Webb had lost face when his quarry escaped, and his anger burned cold and steady. He split his forces, sending half his men around the ravine, while the other half searched for another way through the landslide. Tenbear and Clara had found the deer trail, but it was treacherous going. The path was barely wide enough for a single person, and loose stones threatened to send them tumbling into the ravine below. Clara's small size was actually an advantage here. She could navigate the narrow ledges more easily than an adult. "Don't look down," Tenbear instructed as they climbed. "Keep your eyes on the path ahead." But Clara was braver than he expected. She glanced down and saw the dizzying drop, and then focused on placing each foot carefully. When they reached the top, she was breathing hard, but smiling. "I did it," she said with quiet pride. "Yes, you did." Tenbear agreed. "You're becoming a true warrior." They could see the cavalry in the distance, spreading out across the high mesa like a net. Webb had commandeered fresh horses from a nearby ranch, and his men were now mounted on animals that hadn't been run hard for hours. The landscape ahead was brutal red rock formations jutting from the desert floor, deep arroyos carved by ancient flash floods, and patches of prickly pear cactus that could tear a man's clothes to shreds. But it was also perfect country for someone who knew how to use it. Tenbear led Clara through a maze of towering rock pillars, using every bit of cover available. They moved in short spurts, running from shadow to shadow, always staying just ahead of the pursuing cavalry. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. "I'm thirsty," Clara said during one brief rest, her lips already cracked from dehydration. Tenbear gave her small sips from his canteen, rationing the precious liquid. They were still hours from the nearest water source, and he wasn't sure they would make it without being caught. As they prepared to move again, shots rang out across the desert. But these weren't warning shots. Someone was shooting to kill. Tenbear pulled Clara behind a large boulder just as bullets began chipping stone around them. "There," Webb's voice carried on the wind. "I see them." The cavalry had found their trail, and now they were closing in fast. Tenbear looked around desperately, searching for an escape route. To their left was open ground, certain death. To their right was a narrow wash that might provide cover, but it led deeper into the Badlands, away from any hope of finding water. "This way," he decided, pulling Clara toward the wash. They slid down the sandy bank and ran along the bottom of the wash, their feet slipping on loose gravel. Behind them, they could hear horses' hooves and the shouts of soldiers. The wash twisted and turned, sometimes widening into open areas, sometimes narrowing to barely shoulder width. During their flight, Clara surprised Tenbear with her resilience. When they had to climb over fallen logs blocking the wash, she didn't complain. When thorns from overhanging brush tore at her dress, she pressed on without a word. The frightened little girl he had found tied to a tree was transforming into something harder, more determined. In one of the narrow sections, Tenbear stopped suddenly. There was blood on the ground, fresh blood still wet. Someone else had been here recently, someone who was wounded. "Stay close," he whispered to Clara, his hand moving to his knife. They followed the blood trail around a bend in the wash and found themselves face to face with one of the original bandits who had kidnapped Clara. The man was sitting against the rock wall, clutching his shoulder, where a bullet had torn through muscle and bone. "Well, well," The bandit said, his voice weak but venomous. "Look what we have here." Tenbears recognized him immediately. It was one of the two outlaws they had driven away from Clara's tree. The man must have been tracking them, hoping to reclaim his prize. "You're the one who took her." Tenbears said, his voice deadly quiet. The bandit laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wash walls. "Took her? Hell, I was paid to take her. Paid good money by a man who wants her dead." "Who?" Tenbears demanded, stepping closer. But the bandit was already drawing his gun with his good hand. "Doesn't matter now. You're both gonna die anyway." The gunshot was tremendously loud in the confined space of the wash. But it was Tenbears who fired first, his reflexes honed by years of combat. The bandit's shot went wide, and the man slumped forward dead. Clara had pressed herself against the rock wall, her eyes wide with shock. She had seen death before, but never this close, never this sudden. "It's over," Tenbears said gently, helping her to her feet. "He can't hurt you anymore." But as they prepared to leave, Clara noticed something glinting in the sand near the dead bandit's body. She picked it up, a small silver coin marked with an unfamiliar symbol. "What is this?" she asked. Tenbears examined the coin carefully. It was freshly minted with markings he didn't recognize. But something about it seemed familiar, as if he had seen similar coins somewhere before. "Payment," he said grimly. "This man was paid to take you." The sound of approaching cavalry horses reminded them that they had no time to investigate further. They climbed out of the wash and continued their flight across the Badlands. But now they both knew they were running from more than just an angry army captain. Someone had wanted Clara dead, and that someone had enough money to hire killers. The question was who and why. As they ran, Tenbears found himself thinking about the dead bandit's words. "A man who wants her dead. Not captured, not sold dead." This wasn't about ransom or slavery. This was about eliminating a little girl who posed some kind of threat. But what threat could an 8-year-old possibly pose? The answer would come soon enough, hidden in a blood-stained piece of cloth that Clara carried in her pocket, without even knowing its significance. And when that answer finally emerged, it would change everything they thought they knew about their desperate flight across the Texas plains. The abandoned line shack appeared like a mirage in the heat, its weathered wood and broken windows offering the first real shelter they had seen in hours. Tenbears approached carefully, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The building had been empty for years, but it might still contain useful supplies. Clara collapsed gratefully in the shade of the shack's overhang, her small body drained from the relentless pace. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but she was pale and shaking from dehydration. "Rest here," Tenbears said, checking the building's interior. "I'll see what I can find." The shack had been stripped of anything valuable long ago, but Tenbears discovered a few items that might help them survive: a rusted tin cup, a length of rope, and a small pouch of salt. As he gathered these meager supplies, he heard Clara rustling around in her dress pocket. "I think I lost something," she said, her voice worried. Tenbears looked over to see her pulling various items from her pocket. A small rock she had picked up at the Comanche camp, a button from her dress, and then something that made his blood run cold. It was a handkerchief, white cotton, stained with brown spots that could only be blood. But it wasn't the blood that caught his attention, it was the delicate silver embroidery in one corner. The initials HV were stitched in ornate script, surrounded by an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. The moment he saw those initials clearly, the nagging memory that had been troubling him for days suddenly crystallized with shocking clarity. The expensive silver thread, the distinctive pattern, the quality of the embroidery. He had seen this exact handkerchief before, or one exactly like it. "Where did you get this?" Tenbears asked, his voice carefully controlled. Clara looked up at him with confusion. "I don't know. I think I had it when you found me. Maybe I grabbed it during the attack on the wagon." Tenbears took the handkerchief and examined it closely. The fabric was expensive, the kind of fine cotton that only wealthy men could afford. The silver thread was real, not the cheap imitation that most people used. And the initials were worked with a precision that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Now the half-remembered dream became crystal clear. 3 years ago, he had traded horses with a white land baron at a territorial fair. The man had been polite but condescending, treating Tenbears like a useful savage rather than an equal. But what Tenbears remembered most clearly was the man's vanity, the way he constantly pulled out a monogrammed handkerchief to dab at his forehead, making sure everyone noticed the expensive silver embroidery. The way he insisted on using personalized stationery for even the most casual business correspondence. The way he had signed his name with a flourish, Harlon Voss. Harlon Voss, HV. The pieces began falling into place like stones in an avalanche. Voss owned thousands of acres of prime grazing land, but he had always coveted the Comanche territory to the east. Tenbears remembered the man's comments during their horse trade, how he spoke of the inevitable expansion of civilization and the proper use of good land. How he had studied the Comanche lands with the calculating eye of a man who saw opportunity where others saw treaties. The tribal lands contained some of the best water rights in the territory, and Voss had made no secret of his desire to expand his holdings. But the government had treaties with the Comanche treaties that protected their land from seizure. The only way Voss could claim that territory would be if the Comanche violated those treaties through an act of war. An act of war like kidnapping the governor's niece. Tenbears felt a chill run down his spine as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Voss had hired the bandits to kidnap Clara, but not to hold her for ransom. The plan was much more sinister: kill the girl and make it look like a Comanche attack. The resulting outrage would force the governor to declare war on the Comanche, voiding the treaties and opening their lands to seizure. Clara would die, the Comanche would lose their homeland, and Harlon Voss would become one of the wealthiest men in Texas. "What is it?" Clara asked, noticing the change in Tenbear's expression. He knelt down beside her, his face grave. "Clara, I need you to think carefully. When the men took you from the wagon, did you hear any names? Did anyone mention something about Boss HV? Or Harlon Voss?" Clara frowned, concentrating hard. "I remember... Yes, one of them said something about Boss HV at the very beginning. He said the boss wanted it done clean, no loose ends. What else did he say?" "He talked about land. About how the boss was going to own all the land from here to the Rio Grande once the job was done. And he said something about making it look like Indians did it. That's when I got really scared." Tenbears stood up, his mind racing. Voss had orchestrated the entire scheme from the kidnapping to the frame-up. But something had gone wrong. The bandits had been sloppy, leaving Clara alive when they should have killed her immediately. And now both she and Tenbears were living proof that the Comanche were innocent, which meant Voss would do anything to make sure they never lived to tell their story. "We're not just running from the army," Tenbears said quietly. "We're running from the man who wants you dead, and he won't stop until both of us are in the ground." Clara clutched her ragdoll tighter. "But why I never did anything to hurt anyone?" "Because you're the governor's niece," Tenbears explained. "Your death would give bad men an excuse to steal my people's land. They want to use your blood to justify their greed." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. But this time, it wasn't the cavalry. Through the shack's broken window, Tenbears saw a lone rider approaching a man in a black hat and coat, riding a horse that had clearly been pushed hard. "Hide." Tenbears whispered urgently, pushing Clara behind a pile of old boards. "Don't make a sound." The rider dismounted and approached the shack cautiously. Tenbears recognized him immediately. It was Jake Morrison, a gun for hire known throughout the territory for his skill with a weapon and his complete lack of conscience. Tenbears had seen him once before at a trading post where Morrison had been bragging about his work for wealthy ranchers. Morrison pushed open the shack's door and stepped inside, his hand resting on his pistol butt. "I know you're in here," he called out. "Saw your tracks leading this way." 10 bears remained perfectly still, hoping Morrison would search the building quickly and leave. But the gunfighter was too experienced to be fooled by hope. "Sir Harlon Voss sends his regards." Morrison continued, his voice conversational. "He's real unhappy about the way things have turned out. See, you were supposed to be dead by now, and the little girl was supposed to be found scalped and mutilated. Would have made a nice story for the newspapers." 10 bears felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting emotional would only get them both killed. The plan was simple. Morrison went on, apparently enjoying the sound of his own voice. "Kill the girl, dump her body in Comanche territory, make it look like your people did it. The governor would be so outraged he'd declare war on the Comanche. Once the army drove you off your land, Voss would step in and claim it all legal-like." The gunfighter paused, listening for any sound that might give away his quarry's location. "But you had to go and mess things up, didn't you? Saving her life, protecting her, making yourself into some kind of hero." Clara, listening from behind the boards, had been quietly picking up small stones from the floor. Her child's mind was working furiously, trying to understand everything the bad man was saying. "How many people is he paying?" she whispered so quietly that only 10 bears could hear. Morrison continued his monologue, unaware of the question. "You know Voss has been real thorough about this. He's got Judge Harrison in Austin bought and paid for. It cost him $5,000. Sheriff McKenzie too, and half the county commissioners. Even got Colonel Bradley at Fort Smith on his payroll." 10 bears felt his heart sink. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. "But that's not the best part," Morrison went on. "The governor don't even know his own brother-in-law is behind this. Voss has been real careful to keep his hands clean on the surface. When little Clara here turns up dead, supposedly killed by savages, Governor Pennington will cry for revenge. Public pressure will force him to act." Clara's eyes widened at this revelation. She had heard the man talking about her uncle, but she didn't understand what a brother-in-law was. "What's a brother-in-law?" she whispered to 10 bears. "Your uncle's wife's brother." 10 bears whispered back. "It means Voss is part of your family." The betrayal hit Clara like a physical blow. Not only had men tried to kill her, but one of her own relatives was behind it all. Morrison began moving through the shack more systematically, checking behind broken furniture and in dark corners. "You know what's funny? Voss is paying me $1,000 to clean up this mess. That's more money than most men see in 5 years. 10 bears gripped his knife handle, preparing to fight. Morrison was skilled and dangerous, but 10 bears had the advantage of desperation. He was fighting not just for his own life, but for Clara's. "Wakakur halpert weyer." How many more men does he have? Clara whispered, her young mind trying to gather information. As if answering her question, Morrison continued talking. "Course I ain't the only one on his payroll. Got 6 other boys scattered across the territory, all looking for you. And that's just the hired guns. Like I said, he's got judges, sheriffs, even some army officers in his pocket." A floorboard creaked behind him, and Morrison spun around his gun, appearing in his hand, with practiced speed. But 10 bears was already moving, launching himself from his hiding place with deadly intent. The 2 men crashed together in a tangle of arms and legs, fighting for control of Morrison's weapon. They rolled across the floor, slamming into walls and furniture, each trying to gain the advantage. Clara watched in terror as the 2 men struggled. Morrison was younger and stronger, but 10 bears fought with the desperation of a man protecting his family. The gun went off twice, the bullets splintering wood and sending dust cascading from the ceiling. During the prolonged fight, Morrison kept talking, his voice strained but confident. "You think you're so smart, Chief, but you don't know the half of it. Voss has been planning this for 2 years. He's got a whole network set up." 10 bears managed to slam Morrison's gun hand against the floor. The weapon went flying, and Morrison cursed as he scrambled after it. But Tenbear's was faster, kicking the gun away and then driving his knee into Morrison's stomach. "Tell me more about this network." Tenbear's demanded, pinning Morrison down. Morrison laughed, even though he was struggling to breathe. "Why should I?" "You're gonna die anyway." Clara, who had been listening carefully to everything, surprised them both by speaking up. "Because maybe we can help you if you tell us," she said in her small voice. "My uncle is the governor. He might protect you if you tell the truth." Morrison looked at her with something that might have been pity. "You really don't understand, do you, little girl? Your uncle can't protect nobody. Not when half the territorial government is working for Voss." "Which half?" Clara asked her child's directness, cutting through the adult complications. "Judge Harrison controls most of the legal side." Morrison said, perhaps thinking that sharing information might buy him mercy. "Sheriff Mackenzie handles local law enforcement. Colonel Bradley makes sure the army looks the other way when they need to." Tenbear's felt the scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. "What about the governor himself?" "Clean as a whistle," Morrison replied. "That's what makes it so perfect. When his niece turns up dead, he'll be so mad he'll declare war on the Comanche without thinking twice. And Voss will be right there to console him and help him make the right decisions about the land." Clara had been quietly picking up more stones while they talked. Now she understood something that the adults hadn't said directly. "He's going to kill my uncle too, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Morrison's expression changed, becoming more serious. "You're a smart little girl. Yeah, eventually. Can't have the governor asking too many questions once he calms down." The revelation hit Tenbear's like a physical blow. The conspiracy wasn't just about land, it was about taking control of the entire territory. "You're done talking." Tenbear said, his voice hard as stone. "And you're done working for Voss." Morrison's eyes widened as he realized his danger. "You can't kill me in cold blood. Not in front of the girl." "I'm not going to kill you," Tenbear's replied. "But I'm going to make sure you can't follow us." With quick, efficient movements, Tenbear's used the rope he had found to tie Morrison's hands behind his back. Then he secured the gunfighter to one of the shack's support beams. "Someone will find you eventually," Tenbear said. "But by then, we'll be long gone." As they prepared to leave, Clara looked back at Morrison with an expression that was far too mature for her 8 years. "I feel sorry for you," she said quietly. "You must be very unhappy to want to hurt children for money." Morrison stared at her, seemingly at a loss for words. For a moment, his hardened facade cracked, and something almost human showed through. Tenbear and Clara left the shack behind, but the knowledge they had gained there would change everything. They now knew exactly who their enemy was, and they understood the scope of the conspiracy against them. But they also knew that Voss's resources were vast and his reach extended far beyond anything they had imagined. As they walked away from the abandoned building, Tenbear carefully folded the blood-stained handkerchief and placed it in his medicine pouch. It was evidence of Voss's guilt, but it was also something more. It was proof that truth could survive, even the most elaborate lies. The chase was far from over. But now they had a weapon more powerful than any gun knowledge of their enemy's plans, and the determination to expose the truth before it was too late. The old stagecoach station materialized from the heat shimmer like a ghost from the past. Its adobe walls were cracked and weathered, and tumbleweeds had gathered in the corners of what had once been a bustling way station. But to Tenbear and Clara, exhausted and running low on water, it represented hope. "Maybe there's a well," Clara said, her voice hoarse from thirst. Tenbear approached the ruins carefully, his instincts warning him of danger. The station had been abandoned for years, but recent horse tracks in the sand suggested someone had been here recently. The tracks were deep, indicating a heavy rider on a well-fed horse, not the kind of mount a drifter would own. "Stay close," he whispered to Clara. "Something's not right." They searched the ruins methodically, finding little of value. The well had been filled with sand and debris, and scavengers had long since stripped anything useful. But in what had been the station master's office, Tenbear found something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tobacco ash in a tin cup, still warm to the touch. Someone had been here within the last hour. "Behind you, Chief." The voice was calm and professional, with the slight accent of a man who had learned English as a second language. Tenbear turned slowly, his hands visible and empty, to find himself facing a man who looked more like a businessman than a gunfighter. Miguel Santos was Harlon Voss's most trusted operative, a former Mexican army officer who had turned to bounty hunting after the war. Unlike the crude thugs Voss usually employed, Santos was educated, cultured, and absolutely ruthless. He wore a fine black suit despite the desert heat, and his gun was holstered in hand-tooled leather. "Senor Voss sends his compliments." Santos set his pistol steady and unwavering. He regrets that his previous employees were so incompetent. Tenbear shifted slightly, putting himself between Santos and Clara. "Let the girl go. Your fight is with me." Santos smiled thinly. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The girl has become a liability. She has seen too much, knows too much. Mr. Voss cannot allow her to testify about what really happened to that wagon train. She's just a child." Tenbear said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A child who could destroy everything Mr. Voss has worked for," Santos replied. "Do you know how much money he has invested in this scheme? The governor's chief of staff cost him $3,000. Judge Harrison was $5,000. Sheriff Mackenzie was cheaper, only $2,000. But Colonel Bradley, he wanted $10,000 plus a guarantee of promotion." Clara had been listening to every word, her young mind struggling to understand the implications. "You're going to kill me, because I know you're lying." Santos turned his attention to her, and his expression softened slightly. "I take no pleasure in this, Nina. But business is business." That moment of distraction was all Tenbear needed. He dove to the side, rolling behind a fallen beam, as Santos's first shot shattered the adobe wall where he had been standing. Clara screamed and ran toward the ruins of the station's main room. Santos pursued his movements, controlled and professional. He wasn't the type to waste ammunition with wild shots. Instead, he advanced methodically, using cover and patience to corner his quarry. Tenbear found himself in a desperate situation. Santos was clearly a skilled fighter, and the confined space of the ruins worked against him. But as he crouched behind the fallen beam, he noticed something that might give him an advantage. The old station's fireplace still contained partially burned logs, and scattered around it were the iron tools that had once been used to tend the fire. "Von Chief Tenbear." Santos called out, his voice echoing off the broken walls. "You are only delaying the inevitable. Surrender now, and I will make it quick for both of you." Instead of answering, Tenbear moved silently toward the fireplace. Clara had taken refuge behind an overturned table, her eyes wide with terror, but her body perfectly still. The girl was learning to survive in a world of violence, and her instincts were getting sharper by the hour. Tenbear reached the fireplace and carefully picked up an iron poker, its tip still blackened from old fires. The metal was heavy and solid, not as good as a gun, but better than nothing. He tested its weight, then began creeping toward Santos's position. The bounty hunter was moving more cautiously now, aware that his quarry was armed with something. "You cannot win this fight, Chief. I have killed 27 men in my career, and I am still alive." "What does that tell you?" "It tells me you talk too much." Tenbear replied, his voice coming from a different direction than Santos expected. The gunfighter spun toward the sound, and Tenbear struck. The poker caught Santos across the wrist, and the man's gun went flying. Santos cursed in Spanish and pulled a knife from his boot, the blade gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The two men circled each other warily, each looking for an opening. Santos was younger and faster, but Tenbear had the reach advantage with his makeshift weapon. They feinted and parried, testing each other's defenses. "You fight well for a savage," Santos said, trying to provoke his opponent into making a mistake. Tenbear didn't take the bait. He had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in combat. Instead, he watched Santos's footwork, looking for patterns, weaknesses. The attack came suddenly. Santos lunged forward with his knife, aiming for Tenbear's chest. But the Comanche chief was ready. He sidestepped the thrust and brought the poker down hard on Santos's shoulder. The bounty hunter grunted in pain, but managed to slash with his knife, opening a shallow cut across Tenbear's ribs. Blood began to seep through Tenbear's shirt, but he ignored the pain. He had suffered worse wounds and kept fighting. He swung the poker again this time, catching Santos across the knee. The bounty hunter stumbled, his leg buckling beneath him. Clara had been watching the fight with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. When she saw Santos stumble, she acted without thinking. She grabbed a handful of sand and threw it directly into Santos's eyes, temporarily blinding him. Santos roared in rage and pain, clawing at his eyes with his free hand. Tenbear didn't waste the opportunity. He swung the poker with all his strength, catching the bounty hunter across the temple. Santos crumpled to the ground unconscious. Tenbear stood over the fallen man, panting hard. The cut on his ribs was bleeding freely now, and he could feel his strength beginning to ebb. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. "Is he dead?" Clara asked, her voice small and frightened. Tenbear knelt and checked Santos's pulse. "No, but he'll be out for a while. We need to leave before he wakes up." As they prepared to go, Clara noticed something glinting in the sand near where Santos had fallen. It was a small leather wallet, apparently dropped during the fight. She picked it up and handed it to Tenbear. Inside the wallet were several interesting items: a large sum of money, a letter of credit from a bank in Austin, and most importantly, a telegram from Harlon Voss with specific instructions about eliminating the Comanche and the girl. "This is evidence," Tenbear said, studying the telegram. "Proof that Voss ordered your death." Clara looked at the unconscious bounty hunter, then at the blood on Tenbear's shirt. "Will there be more of them?" Tenbear folded the telegram carefully and put it in his own pocket along with the blood-stained handkerchief. "Yes, but now we know exactly who's sending them, and we have proof of his guilt. That changes everything." As they left the ruins of the stagecoach station, Tenbear felt a mixture of hope and dread. They had survived another encounter, and they had gained valuable evidence. But Santos was just one of many killers that Voss could afford to hire, and their luck couldn't hold forever. The chase was far from over, and the most dangerous part was still ahead. But now they had something more than just hope. They had the truth and the determination to make sure it was heard. The Devil's Canyon stretched before them like a wound in the earth, its red rock walls rising 300 feet on either side. At the bottom, a river ran swollen with recent rains, its waters dark and churning with dangerous currents. Tenbear knew this place well. It was sacred to his people, a place where warriors came to prove their courage. Today it might become their tomb. They had been riding hard for 2 days, pushing their stolen horses to the limit. The animals were exhausted, their flanks lathered with sweat. But Tenbear had no choice. Behind them, the net was closing with methodical precision. Captain Webb and his cavalry had been joined by a dozen bounty hunters, all drawn by the massive reward Harlon Voss had placed on their heads. The official bounty was for their capture, but everyone involved knew the real payment would come only if they were brought back dead. "We can't go any further," Clara said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "The horses are finished." Tenbear looked at their mounts and knew she was right. The animals were on the verge of collapse, their breathing labored and their legs trembling. They had given everything they had, but it wasn't enough. "We'll have to make our stand here," he said, dismounting and helping Clara down. "This is as good a place as any." The canyon offered some tactical advantages. The narrow entrance would force their pursuers to attack in a limited front, and the rock walls provided cover. But it was also a trap. If they were overwhelmed, there would be no escape, except over the cliff into the raging river below. Clara looked around at the towering walls and seemed to understand their situation. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" Tenbear knelt beside her, his weathered face serious, but not afraid. "Maybe. But if we do, we'll die fighting. And sometimes that's all a warrior can ask for." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance. Their pursuers had found them. The first to appear was Captain Webb, his blue uniform dusty and his face grim with determination. Behind him came his remaining cavalry soldiers, their weapons ready. But it was the men who followed that made Tenbear's blood run cold. Jake Morrison rode with the column, his wrists still bearing rope burns from his time tied up in the line shack. Miguel Santos was there too, his head bandaged, but his eyes burning with the desire for revenge. And behind them came a collection of bounty hunters, gunfighters, and assassins, all united by their shared greed. But it was the final rider who shocked Tenbear the most. Harlon Voss himself had come to witness the end of his grand scheme, riding a magnificent bay stallion, and dressed in an expensive suit as if he were attending a social function rather than a murder. "Chief Tenbear." Voss called out, his voice carrying easily across the canyon. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Tenbear stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the assembled killers. "The girl belongs to no one. She's under my protection." Voss laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Protection? Look around you, Chief. You're outnumbered 20-1. Your horse is finished and there's nowhere to run. This canyon is your grave. Then I'll make it yours too." Tenbear replied, his hand moving to his rifle. The tension in the canyon was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Men checked their weapons and chose their positions, preparing for the violence that was about to erupt. "You don't have to die for her," Webb said, trying one last time to avoid a massacre. "Surrender the girl, and I'll guarantee you safe passage back to your people." Tenbear smiled grimly. "You know I can't do that, Captain. The girl has seen too much. She knows the truth about what happened to that wagon train." "The truth?" Voss laughed again. "The truth is whatever I say it is. I own half the officials in this territory, and I can buy the other half. Who's going to believe a savage and a traumatized child over a respected businessman?" Clara stepped forward, her young voice ringing clear in the canyon air. "I'll tell everyone what really happened. I'll tell them you paid those men to kill me." Voss's expression hardened. "No, little girl, you won't tell anyone anything." He raised his hand and the canyon erupted in gunfire. Tenbear dove behind a boulder, pulling Clara with him as bullets whined off the rock walls. The confined space magnified the sound of the gunshots, making it seem like the world was ending in thunder and smoke. "Stay down," Tenbear shouted over the noise, returning fire with his rifle. "Don't move unless I tell you to." The battle was furious and intense. Tenbear was an excellent marksman, and the rocky terrain gave him good cover. But he was vastly outnumbered, and his ammunition was limited. One by one, his shots found their marks, but for every man he dropped, two more seemed to take his place. Clara crouched behind the boulder, her heart pounding with fear, but her mind surprisingly clear. She watched Tenbear fight, saw how he aimed carefully to conserve ammunition, how he used the terrain to his advantage. Even in the midst of terror, she was still learning. The gunfight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Men shouted orders and curses, and the sound of ricocheting bullets filled the canyon like deadly music. A bullet clipped Tenbear's left shoulder, spinning him around. Blood soaked through his shirt, and he staggered, his vision blurring. Another shot grazed his temple, and he felt warm blood trickling down his face. "I'm hit." He gasped, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Clara saw what was happening and knew she had to act. She crawled toward a rifle that had been dropped by one of the fallen attackers. The weapon was almost as long as she was tall, but she managed to drag it back to their position. "I can help," she said, her voice determined despite her fear. Tenbears looked at her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. This 8-year-old girl had been through hell, but she was still fighting, still refusing to give up. "All right," he said, checking the rifle's ammunition. "But you do exactly what I tell you, understand?" Clara nodded, her small hands gripping the rifle's stock. Tenbears positioned the weapon so that Clara could steady it while he aimed and fired. Together they managed to keep their attackers at bay, but just barely. Then disaster struck. A bullet caught Tenbears in the chest, high on the right side. He cried out in pain and collapsed behind the boulder, blood spreading across his shirt. "Tenbears!" Clara screamed, dropping the rifle and crawling to his side. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Clara pressed her small hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding in the way she had seen him do with herbs and bandages. But blood kept seeping through her fingers. The attackers, seeing their quarry was down, began advancing more boldly. Clara looked around desperately, knowing she had to do something to protect Tenbears while he was unconscious. She remembered his lessons about using the terrain. Near their position was a pile of loose rocks that had fallen from the canyon wall. If she could somehow knock them down. Clara crawled to the rock pile and began pushing at the largest stone. It was heavy, but fear gave her strength. The rock shifted, then began to roll, dislodging others in its path. A small avalanche cascaded down toward the advancing attackers, forcing them to scramble for cover. The noise and confusion bought precious time. Tenbears' eyes fluttered open, and he saw Clara kneeling beside him, her small face streaked with his blood. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "Not yet," he said through gritted teeth, "but close." With Clara's help, he managed to sit up against the boulder. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. He could still fight, though each movement sent waves of pain through his body. "We need to get out of here," he said, looking around at their desperate situation. But their attackers had regrouped and were advancing again. And now Voss, growing impatient with the prolonged battle, shouted a new command. "Burn them out, set fire to the brush." Santos and Morrison began gathering dry wood and brush, preparing to create a fire that would force Tenbears and Clara into the open. The smoke would make their position untenable, and they would have to choose between burning alive or facing the guns. Tenbears watched the flames beginning to catch and knew they had only minutes before their cover became useless. He looked at Clara, then at the raging river far below. It was a desperate plan, but it was their only chance. "Clara," he said quietly, "I need you to trust me completely." She looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her nod without question. "I trust you. When I give the signal, we're going to jump." Clara's eyes widened as she understood what he meant. The cliff was 300 feet high, and the river below was churning with dangerous currents. It was almost certainly suicide. "Will we die?" she asked. Tenbears was quiet for a moment, watching the flames beginning to spread rapidly through the dry brush. The fire was moving faster than he had expected, racing toward them, with hungry tongues of orange and red. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if we stay here, we'll definitely die. And if we jump, there's a chance we might live." Clara clutched her rag doll tighter, then suddenly pulled something from her pocket. It was the blood-stained handkerchief, with Harlon Voss's initials, the key piece of evidence that could expose the conspiracy. "If we don't make it," she said, holding out the handkerchief, "someone should know the truth." Tenbears took the cloth and folded it carefully into his own pocket. "We'll make it. We have to." The fire was spreading with terrifying speed now, and the smoke was getting thicker. The flames were only yards away, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Their attackers were moving closer, confident that the fire would drive their quarry into the open, and the smoke's too thick. Clara gasped, coughing hard. "I can't breathe." Tenbears knew they were out of time. Behind them, he could hear Voss screaming orders, his voice hoarse with frustration and rage. The fire was crackling like a living thing consuming everything in its path. "And now!" Tenbears shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. "Run!" Together, they ran toward the cliff's edge. Behind them, they could hear Voss screaming in rage and frustration. Gunshots cracked through the air bullets, whistling past their ears. The fire was right behind them, the heat singeing their clothes and hair. "Keep running!" Tenbears shouted over the roar of flames and gunfire. And then they were at the edge, the vast canyon yawning before them. The river looked impossibly far below a ribbon of dark water threading through the rocks. "Together," Tenbears said, squeezing Clara's hand. They leaped. The fall seemed to last forever. The canyon walls flashed past in a blur of red rock and shadow. Clara's scream was lost in the wind, but she held tight to Tenbear's hand. The ground rushed up to meet them, but it wasn't ground. It was water, dark and violent and utterly unforgiving. The impact drove the breath from their lungs and nearly tore them apart. The cold water closed over their heads, and for a moment, everything was silent and dark. Then the current caught them, and their real fight for survival began. The river was a monster full of hidden rocks and dangerous eddies that tried to pull them under. Tenbears fought to keep his head above water to keep hold of Clara's hand, as the current battered them against stones and dragged them under submerged logs. A hidden rock caught Tenbears in the head, and stars exploded across his vision. Blood mixed with river water, and he felt his grip on Clara's hand weakening. But he refused to let go, even as the current tried to tear them apart. Clara was struggling too, her small body no match for the powerful current. She went under swallowing water, her lungs burning. But just as she felt herself being swept away, Tenbear's grip tightened, and he pulled her back to the surface. They were battered against rocks, pulled under by powerful currents, and spun around until they lost all sense of direction. Clara's rag doll was torn from her grasp by the current disappearing into the churning water. But she had no time to mourn its loss, as all her energy was focused on staying alive. Tenbears felt his strength ebbing away with each passing moment. The bullet wound in his chest was bleeding freely, and the cold water was sapping his remaining energy. But he refused to let go of Clara's hand. Above them, on the canyon rim, Harlon Voss stared down at the churning water with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His perfect plan had been ruined by a stubborn Indian and a brave little girl. "Are they dead?" Webb asked, peering over the edge. Voss was quiet for a long moment, watching the river carry its burden toward the distant plains. "They have to be. No one could survive that fall." But even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely sure. And that uncertainty would haunt him in the days to come. The river carried them for miles, its powerful current sweeping them downstream like leaves in a flood. Tenbears fought to stay conscious, to keep his grip on Clara's hand as the water battered them against rocks and dragged them under submerged logs. His wounded chest burned like fire, and his lungs screamed for air. But every time he felt himself weakening, he would see Clara's face and find the strength to keep fighting. She was depending on him, and he would not let her down. Clara, for her part, had lost her beloved rag doll in the river. The toy that had been her constant companion since the wagon train attack was gone, swept away by the merciless current. But she had gained something more valuable, a strength she didn't know she possessed. When they finally washed ashore on a sandbar 3 miles downstream, both were barely conscious. Tenbears dragged himself onto the sand, then pulled Clara up beside him. They lay there gasping, their clothes torn, and their bodies bruised, but alive. "We made it," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Tenbears nodded, unable to speak. His chest wound was bleeding heavily, and he could feel the onset of fever. But they had escaped the trap, and that was what mattered. Above them, buzzards circled in the sky, attracted by the smell of blood. But they were scavengers, not hunters. The real danger was still miles away, searching the riverbank for bodies. As the sun began to set, Tenbear forced himself to his feet. They couldn't stay here. Voss's men would be following the river looking for confirmation of their deaths. They needed to find shelter, and they needed to find it fast. "Can you walk?" he asked Clara. She nodded, though her legs were shaking with exhaustion. "Where are we going?" Tenbear looked around, trying to get his bearings. The landscape was unfamiliar, but he could see smoke rising in the distance. "There's a settlement that way. Quaker mission, I think. They might help us." The mission was further than it looked, and by the time they reached it, both were stumbling with fatigue. The Quaker settlement was small but well-maintained, its simple buildings radiating an air of peace and sanctuary. Brother Samuel, the mission's leader, met them at the gate. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He took one look at Tenbear and Clara and immediately ushered them inside. "They are in need of healing," he said in the formal Quaker manner. "Come, we will tend thy wounds." The Quakers asked no questions about their identity or their injuries. They simply provided food, shelter, and medical care. Tenbear's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and Clara was given a warm bed and fresh clothes. That night, as Tenbear sat by Clara's bedside, she spoke about everything they had been through. "I lost my doll," she said sadly. "She was all I had left of my old life." Tenbear reached into his pocket and pulled out the blood-stained handkerchief, somehow still intact despite their ordeal. "You still have this. And this is more important than any doll." Clara took the handkerchief and studied the embroidered initials. "This is what started it all, isn't it, Mr. Voss's handkerchief?" "Yes. And it's what will end it too. This is proof of what he did, proof that he ordered your death." Clara was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Tenbear with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. "Will you leave me here?" The question cut through Tenbear like a knife. He had grown to love this brave little girl, had come to think of her as the daughter he had lost. But he also knew that staying with her would put her in constant danger. "The Quakers will take good care of you," he said gently. "They'll keep you safe while we figure out how to get this evidence to the right people." Tears began to roll down Clara's cheeks. "But you're my family now. You saved me. You protected me." Tenbear felt his own eyes growing wet. "You saved me too, Clara. You reminded me what it means to fight for something worth protecting." Brother Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face concerned. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are riders approaching, men with guns." Tenbear was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his rifle. But Brother Samuel shook his head. "These are not thy enemies, I think. They wear the uniform of the territorial government." Through the window, Tenbear could see a small group of riders approaching under a flag of truce. At their head rode a man in an expensive suit, not Harlon Voss, but someone equally well-dressed and official-looking. "That's Governor Pennington," Clara said, recognizing her uncle, despite the years that had passed since she had last seen him. "But how did he know we were here?" The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the Quaker women approached with a telegraph message. "This arrived an hour ago," she said. "It's addressed to Clara Pennington." Clara read the message with growing amazement. It was from Captain Webb, and it told a story that changed everything. After the battle at Devil's Canyon, Webb had been ordered to search for bodies. But instead of finding Tenbear and Clara, he had found something else: Miguel Santos, badly wounded, but still alive, and in his possession a detailed confession. Santos, facing death from his injuries and haunted by what he had witnessed, had decided to clear his conscience. He had told Webb everything about Voss's conspiracy, about the planned murder, about the frame-up of the Comanche. The confession was detailed and damning, naming names and providing evidence that could not be ignored. Governor Pennington had received the confession and immediately ordered Voss's arrest. The land baron was now in custody, along with his remaining associates. The conspiracy had been exposed, and the truth had finally come out. "It's over," Clara said, her voice filled with wonder. "Mr. Voss can't hurt us anymore." Tenbear nodded, but he felt a deep sadness mixed with his relief. The danger was past, but that meant his time with Clara was ending. She would return to her uncle's care, and he would go back to his people. Their unlikely family was about to be broken apart. Governor Pennington dismounted and approached the mission, his face grave with the weight of what he had learned. When he saw Clara, his expression softened with relief and love. "Clara," he said, kneeling down and opening his arms, "thank God you're alive." But Clara didn't run to him immediately. Instead, she looked back at Tenbear, her eyes filled with confusion and loss. "What happens now?" she asked. The territorial courthouse in Austin was packed with spectators as Harlon Voss stood trial for conspiracy kidnapping and attempted murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Santos's confession, the telegram found in the bounty hunter's possession, and most damning of all, the blood-stained handkerchief with Voss's initials that Clara had carried throughout their ordeal. Tenbear testified on the first day, his calm voice recounting the events that had led to their desperate flight across the Badlands. He spoke of finding Clara tied to a tree of the Army's pursuit, and of the growing realization that they were being hunted by more than just military justice. Clara testified on the second day, her young voice clear and strong, as she told the court about the wagon train attack, about the kindness Tenbear had shown her, and about the men who had tried to kill them both. The courtroom was silent as she described their jump from Devil's Canyon, and several spectators wiped away tears. Voss's lawyer tried to discredit their testimony, suggesting that Clara had been brainwashed by her captors, and that Tenbear was simply trying to avoid punishment for kidnapping. But the physical evidence was too strong, and Santos's confession too detailed to be dismissed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Voss was sentenced to life in prison, his vast landholdings confiscated by the territorial government. His political allies distanced themselves from him, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Judge Harrison, Sheriff Mackenzie, and Colonel Bradley were also arrested and tried. The corruption network that Voss had built was systematically dismantled, and new officials were appointed to replace those who had been bought. But the trial's end brought no joy to Clara. She had been staying with her uncle, the governor, in his mansion in Austin. She had fine clothes, good food, and all the toys a little girl could want. But she was miserable. "I want to see him," she told her uncle for the 100th time. "I want to see Tenbear." Governor Pennington was a kind man, but he was also a politician. The idea of his niece maintaining a relationship with a Comanche chief was politically problematic. "Clara, you need to understand. I understand perfectly." Clara interrupted, her voice showing a strength that surprised him. "You're worried about what people will think. But I don't care what people think. He's my family." The governor sighed. He had been trying to arrange a meeting between Clara and Tenbear, but the logistics were complicated. The Comanche chief was technically still under investigation, though all charges had been dropped. And public sentiment, while sympathetic to their story, was still divided about Indians and whites forming close relationships. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally. 3 weeks later, Brother Samuel from the Quaker mission arrived with a proposal. The mission was organizing a peace gathering between local tribes and white settlers, aimed at promoting understanding and preventing future conflicts. Would the governor allow Clara to attend? Governor Pennington saw the wisdom in the proposal. A public appearance at a peace gathering would demonstrate that Clara held no ill will toward the Comanche people, and it would provide an opportunity for her to see Tenbear again under appropriate circumstances. The gathering was held in a meadow outside Austin with representatives from several tribes, as well as prominent white citizens. Tenbear arrived with a small delegation from his people, his bearing dignified despite the ordeal he had been through. When Clara saw him, she broke away from her uncle and ran across the field. Tenbear knelt down and caught her in his arms, his stoic facade cracking for just a moment. "I thought I'd never see you again," Clara whispered. I promised you'd be safe, Tenbear replied. But I never promised we'd be apart forever. They talked for hours, sharing stories and catching up on the weeks they had been separated. Tenbear told her about his return to his people, about the respect he had gained for his actions, and about the peace negotiations that were beginning between the tribes and the territorial government. Clara told him about her life with her uncle, about the nightmares that still sometimes woke her, and about the Comanche blanket she kept on her bed, the one he had given her during their time together. As the sun began to set, it became clear that their time together was ending once again. But this time, it felt different. Not like a goodbye, but like a promise. "Will I see you again?" Clara asked. Tenbear smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a genuine smile. "The mission is only a day's ride from here, and Brother Samuel has invited me to visit whenever I wish." Governor Pennington approached them as the gathering began to break up. He had been watching their reunion with interest, and he had made a decision. "Clara," he said, "Brother Samuel has made an interesting proposal. He suggested that you might benefit from spending some time at the mission, learning about different cultures, helping with their peace efforts." Clara's eyes widened with hope. "Really, I could visit the mission. More than visit," the governor said. "You could help teach the children there, both Indian and white. Brother Samuel thinks you have a unique perspective that could be valuable." It was a perfect solution. Clara would have a purpose, a way to use her experiences to help others. And she would be close enough to maintain her relationship with Tenbear. 6 months later, Clara was thriving at the mission. She had learned to speak fluent Comanche, and she was helping to teach white children about Indian culture while also helping Indian children learn English. She was also working with Brother Samuel to write a book about her experiences, a true account that would help others understand the humanity on both sides of the cultural divide. Tenbear visited the mission regularly, sometimes bringing other tribal members who were interested in the peace efforts. He and Clara would walk together in the mission's garden, talking about everything and nothing, maintaining the bond that had been forged in the fires of danger and adversity. On a warm spring day, as they sat by the mission's well, Clara pulled something from her pocket. It was the blood-stained handkerchief that had played such a crucial role in their story, now carefully cleaned and preserved. "I keep it to remember," she said. "Not the bad things, but the good things. How we survived, how we found each other." Tenbear nodded. "Some bonds are stronger than blood," he said. "Stronger than race or culture or the opinions of others." Clara smiled and took his weathered hand in her small one. "You're my family," she said simply. "Nothing will ever change that." As they sat together, a young Comanche boy approached them shyly. He was one of the children Clara had been teaching, and he held something in his hands, a small wooden doll he had carved himself. "For you," he said in careful English, offering the doll to Clara, "to replace the one you lost." Clara accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. It wasn't her old rag doll, but it was something else, a symbol of the new family she had found, the new life she had built from the ashes of tragedy. "Thank you," she said, hugging the boy gently. "It's perfect." Tenbear watched the exchange with a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what they had fought for, not just survival, but the chance to build something better. The chance to prove that understanding and compassion could triumph over hatred and greed. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tenbear and Clara walked back toward the mission buildings. Around them, children of different races played together, their laughter echoing across the peaceful grounds. "Do you think Mr. Voss ever understood?" Clara asked suddenly. "Why what he did was wrong?" Tenbear considered the question carefully. "I think he understood the cost of his actions," he said finally. "Whether he understood the morality of them, that's between him and his conscience." Clara nodded, satisfied with the answer. At 9 years old, she had learned that the world was complex, that good and evil weren't always clearly defined. But she had also learned that choosing to do right, even when it was difficult, was what made a person truly strong. As they reached the mission's main building, they could hear the sound of evening prayers beginning. The voices of the congregation rose in harmony, white and Indian, young and old, all united in their hope for peace. Tenbear and Clara joined the gathering, their voices adding to the chorus. They had traveled a long road to reach this moment, faced dangers that had tested their courage and their faith in each other. But they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. The blood-stained handkerchief that had once been evidence of a conspiracy to destroy them now resided in Clara's memory box alongside other treasures from their journey together. It served as a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had overcome. Their story was complete, every question answered, every relationship resolved, every character's fate determined. The conspiracy had been exposed, and the guilty punished, and the innocent protected. Most importantly, two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances had discovered that the best families are sometimes the ones we choose for ourselves. As the evening service ended and the congregation began to disperse, Clara looked up at Tenbear with a smile that held all the warmth of a daughter's love. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Tenbear smiled back, his weathered face soft with affection. "Thank you for teaching me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love and protect you when the world seems determined to tear you apart." In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, its voice carrying across the vast expanse of the Texas plains. But here at the mission, surrounded by the sounds of peace and the warmth of chosen family, Clara and Tenbear felt only contentment. Their journey had begun with violence and tragedy, but it had ended with hope and love. The handkerchief that had once been stained with blood now represented something far more powerful, the triumph of truth over lies, of compassion over cruelty, and of the unbreakable bonds that can form between two souls who refuse to let the darkness win. The story was over, but their family would last forever. And in years to come, when Clara was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of a Comanche chief who saved a little girl's life, and how that act of kindness changed both their worlds forever. The blood on the handkerchief had been washed away, but the love it represented would endure for all time.